An orphan, fearing for her life, bears a child for a wealthy man at the behest of her destitute stepmother. But when he sees the child, he is stunned. The thud of the canvas satchel on the worn wooden floorboards made me jump. A cloud of gray dust rose slowly in the slivers of dim post-lunch light slanting through the window. I stood frozen by the wood stove, the cast-iron pot of potatoes still on the heat. "Pack your things, you little charity case. I'm putting you to work." My step-aunt Teresa spat the words out, a nervous energy about her. She stood by the doorway, glancing anxiously at the closed door, before hastily shoving a thick wad of cash into the bosom of her dress. Her sinewy hands, accustomed to hard labor, trembled noticeably. The hot handle of the potholder slipped from my grasp. The iron pot tilted, and boiling water hissed as it hit the hot brick of the stove, instantly turning to steam. I didn't even flinch. My aunt's words were a cruel, absurd joke that my mind refused to process. "What are you gawking at? Get a move on." Teresa stepped toward me, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. I said, "Pack your rags. They're coming for you in the morning." "Who's coming?" My own voice was a hoarse, foreign sound. "What are you talking about, Aunt Teresa? I have Bobby. We made plans." My step-aunt let out a ragged breath, closing the distance between us and grabbing my shoulder with a painful grip. "Forget about your precious Bobby. You belong to Matthew Thorne now, or rather, to his wife Eleanor. They paid off my debt at the general store for you. My name is Hope. I am 88 years old now. At my age, people usually talk about their grandchildren, their garden harvests, or complain about their blood pressure. But today, I want to tell you the truth. A truth that for many years was hidden behind the beautiful facades of strong families. I will tell you how, at 19, I was bought, not to work in the fields or to help around the house. I was bought to be a living incubator. Back then, in the post-war 50s, life in our small logging town was just beginning to find its footing. People still remembered the lean years, clinging to every dollar, every sack of flour. We survived as best we could. My mother died when I was young. My father was lost in a logging accident, and I was left an orphan in my step-aunt's care. I was just an ordinary girl, wearing dresses sewn from old flour sacks, my thick blonde hair in a long braid. And, like any young woman, I lived on foolish, sweet illusions. Just a few days before that satchel hit the floor, I was standing at the edge of town with Bobby. It was a warm August evening. The earth, baked by the sun, smelled of dust, wormwood, and overripe apples. Bobby sat on a fallen log, playing his old accordion. He was the most sought-after boy in town, rosy-cheeked, cheerful, with unruly reddish curls that kept falling over his forehead. He was always dressed neatly, in a clean shirt ironed by his mother and boots without a single patch. When he played, the neighborhood girls would linger by their fences, but he only had eyes for me. "Hope," he said that evening, setting his accordion aside. He came over and took my hand in his soft ones, fingers unused to heavy labor. "Just wait until fall. We'll sell the harvest, I'll save up some money, and I'll ask for your hand." He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a small circle, twisted from a thick piece of copper wire. Awkwardly, but with a wide smile, he slipped the makeshift ring onto my fourth finger. "It's just for now," he said proudly. "We'll get a real one later. You'll be mine, you hear? I won't give you up to anyone." I looked at that tarnished piece of copper and believed every word. I believed his promise was stronger than my step-aunt's bitterness, stronger than the poverty of our town. I was sure my life was already planned out for years to come. A fall wedding, our own home, children with the man I loved. That illusion shattered the moment a sturdy wagon pulled into my step-aunt's yard. It happened the day before our conversation by the stove. I was chopping wood behind the shed when I heard the contented snort of a horse and the creak of well-greased springs. Peeking around the corner, I saw a wagon hitched to a large gelding with a new leather harness. By our town's standards, this was a sign of great wealth. A woman climbed down heavily from the wagon. It was Eleanor, the wife of Matthew Thorne, the foreman of the logging crew, and the best carpenter in the county. This city woman had moved to our town a few years ago when she married the wealthy widower. She openly despised the locals. Always well-dressed in sturdy silk dresses with an expensive, colorful shawl over her shoulders, she carried herself as if everyone around her was her servant. Her thin lips were always pressed into a disdainful line. She entered the house without knocking. I followed, wiping my dirty hands on my apron. Teresa was fussing at the table, wiping down the already clean wooden surface. The guest did not sit. She stopped in the middle of the room and slowly, appraisingly, looked me up and down. "Is this the one?" she asked, not addressing me directly. "Yes, Mrs. Thorne, this is her," Teresa fawned, looking into the guest's eyes with a subservient gaze. "She's a strong girl, never been sick a day in her life, works like 3 people. Then, the woman approached me. She smelled of expensive strawberry soap and mothballs. I instinctively pressed my back against the log wall. She reached out a hand with neat, short-trimmed nails and roughly grabbed my chin, turning my face to the right, then to the left. "Open your mouth," she commanded. Confused, I parted my lips. She unceremoniously inspected my teeth, then ran a hand down my back, to my hips. I tried to pull away, but my step-aunt discreetly but forcefully jabbed me in the side with her fist, silently telling me to stand still. "Wide hips, that's good. She'll carry easily," the woman said, then disdainfully wiped her hand on her silk handkerchief as if she had touched something dirty. "A bit pale, but that can be fixed. Milk and meat will put some color in her cheeks. Thick hair, all right, she'll do." She turned to Teresa, pulled a thick paper-wrapped bundle from the deep pocket of her skirt, and threw it on the table. "Here's the amount to cover your shortfall at the company store, and a little extra to keep you quiet. My husband will be here with the wagon for her tomorrow. Don't bother packing her things. I'll give her some of my old dresses. No need to bring rags into a wealthy home. And what about your husband, Mr. Thorne? Does he agree?" Teresa asked timidly, hiding the bundle. Eleanor smirked. There was so much cold power in that smile that it made me uneasy. "Matthew will do as I tell him. I need an heir in this house, to tie him to me for good. I'm barren, God didn't see fit to give me children. But this one will carry one for me. I'll take the child and register it as my own. We'll tell the town I went to the city for confinement, and that we hired the girl to help around the house. Once she gives birth, we'll throw her out with some money and make sure she keeps her mouth shut." She turned and left the house. I stood there, clutching my hands to my chest. It was hard to breathe. The air in the house suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. I had just been inspected like a horse at a fair and bought to bear a child for a stranger. It was then, after Eleanor's departure, that Teresa threw my satchel on the floor. "Aunt Teresa, I'm not going." I tried to step toward the door, but my Aunt blocked my path. Her face contorted. Her greedy, beady eyes darted around. She backed me up against the still warm stove. The bricks burned through the thin fabric of my dress, but I didn't dare move. "Listen to me, you little tramp," my Aunt hissed, her breath heavy in my face. "I have a huge debt at the store. If the auditor comes tomorrow, I'll be sent to jail. I'm not going to prison because of you." She grabbed the collar of my dress, squeezing the skin on my neck painfully. "If you run, I'll go straight to the sheriff. I'll say you're the one who cleaned out the cash register. You have no papers. They don't give them to people like us in this town. I'll have you thrown out of this house. No one will take you in. You'll be sent away like a thief. You'll rot in a labor camp or die in a ditch. Do you understand me?" She pushed me away with force. I hit my head on the brickwork and slowly slid to the floor. Teresa stepped over my legs, blew out the kerosene lamp, and went to her room, bolting the door behind her. The house became dark and quiet. The only sound was the crackling of the cooling embers in the stove. I sat on the floor, hugging my knees. A panicky, animal fear of the sheriff and prison warred with a desperate hope. "Bobby, my Bobby," he had promised. He was the most popular boy in town. He was strong. He drove a tractor. We would run away, right now, tonight. We would go through the woods to the next county, get jobs in construction, disappear into a city. I got up on unsteady legs, threw an old jacket over my shoulders without even buttoning it, opened the door, and stepped into the night. A torrential rain was falling. The autumn weather had arrived harshly and without warning. The cold water instantly soaked my hair and thin dress. Under my feet was a thick, icy mud. I ran barefoot. My boots were in the entryway, and I was afraid to go back for them. My step-aunt might hear. The mud squished between my toes. Sharp stones cut my skin, but I didn't feel the pain. I ran through the whole town, slipping and stumbling in the deep puddles. The dogs in the yards barked lazily from their houses, unwilling to come out into the freezing rain. Bobby's house was at the other end of the town. I ran to the low window of his bedroom and began to tap quickly and lightly with my knuckles on the wet glass. I had to wait a long time. The rain poured down my face, my clothes clung to my body, and my teeth chattered from the cold. Finally, a match flickered inside. The door to the entryway creaked. Bobby came out onto the porch, a jacket thrown over a clean, ironed shirt. He was squinting from sleep and shivering in the damp wind. "Hope, what are you doing out in the middle of the night?" he asked, his voice hoarse with sleep. I rushed to the porch, grabbing the wooden railing with both hands. "Bobby, I'm in trouble." I was out of breath from running and the tears that were welling up. The words tumbled out of my mouth in short, ragged phrases. "My step-aunt sold me to Eleanor Thorne. Matthew is coming for me tomorrow. They're using me as an incubator, to have a baby for them, and then they're going to kick me out. Bobby, please, we have to run away." I held out my hands, caked in clay, and grabbed the hem of his jacket. "Let's go right now, to the city. I'll work, I'll scrub floors, I'll do laundry. Just don't let them take me." I looked into his face, expecting to see anger, expecting him to clench his fists, go back into the house for his things, and for us to leave together. But Bobby's face, in the dim light from the window, began to change. The rosy color vanished. His skin turned an unpleasant gray. He quickly glanced back at the door of his house, as if afraid someone might hear us. "To Matthew Thorne?" he asked, and his voice trembled. "The foreman?" "Yes, Bobby, I'm begging you, let's go." He looked down at my hands. My dirty, trembling fingers were clutching the clean fabric of his jacket, touching the pristine white collar of his shirt, leaving dark smudges of clay. A look of disgust twisted Bobby's face. He didn't just step back. He harshly, forcefully, pulled my cold fingers from his clothes, as if shaking off dirt. "Where am I going to run with you?" he said, stepping back onto the top step. There was no pity in his voice, only irritation and fear. "My mother is sick, I have no money. Thorne is a tough man, he has connections in the county. He'll crush me if I take what he's bought." I stood in the rain, my hands at my sides. Water streamed down my face, mixing with tears, but I didn't try to wipe them away. "But you promised, Bobby," I whispered. "You gave me this ring." "I promise a lot of things," he snapped, stuffing his hands in his pockets. "I promised in the fall, when the harvest comes in. Where am I supposed to take you now? We'll be a disgrace to the whole county. You sort it out with your step-aunt, don't drag me into it." Suddenly, the window flew open. From the darkness of the house, Bobby's mother leaned out. A coarse, heavy-set woman who always judged people by their wealth. "Get out of my yard, you beggar!" she shouted so loudly that the neighbor's dog started barking. "What do you think you're doing? Trying to ruin my boy? We don't need damaged goods, sold off for debts. Get lost before I let the dogs out." The window slammed shut with a crash. Bobby didn't look at me. He turned quickly, slipped into the entryway, and the heavy iron bolt on the other side of the door clicked loudly into place. That sound hit me harder than my step-aunt's threats. I was left alone in the yard. The rain continued to fall, but I no longer felt the cold. Something inside me snapped and fell heavily. A strange feeling of absolute, deafening emptiness washed over me. My body felt heavy, clumsy, like it belonged to someone else. I pulled the copper ring from my finger, a ring that just that afternoon had seemed like the most precious treasure in the world, and clenched it in my palm. The copper was now icy and hard. Illusions don't fade gracefully. They shatter in a muddy puddle under a stranger's window. I turned and slowly walked back. My feet sank into the clay, but I didn't even try to pick my way. I wasn't crying. There were no more tears. A broken person was returning to her step-aunt's house through the autumn night, ready to be loaded onto a wagon in the morning and taken away to a strange new life. The wagon lurched in a deep rut, and the squeal of the ungreased wheel grated on my frayed nerves. I sat on the hard planks, my cold feet tucked under me. The damp hem of my dress, still not dry from my nighttime escape in the rain, clung unpleasantly to my calves. Matthew sat on the driver's seat with his back to me. His broad, immense back in a sturdy woolen jacket swayed in time with the big gelding steps. He smelled of tar, leather, and tobacco. He hadn't said a single word the entire way from my step-aunt's house. He had just silently taken my meager bundle from Teresa's fussing hands, tossed it onto the wagon, and given me a short nod. "Get in." The town was waking up. Cows mooed in the morning mist, and gates creaked open and shut. The few people out stopped by their fences, following our wagon with long, persistent stares. I lowered my head, hiding my face under the ends of my old scarf. It felt as if I had a brand on my forehead, bought for debt. We pulled up to a high plank fence at the other end of town. Matthew jumped down, his big boots thudding heavily on the ground, and swung open the heavy gates. The gelding walked into the yard with a familiar air. I timidly raised my eyes. The yard was impressive in its size and order. Not a speck of dust, not a single stray wood chip. Sturdy barns with new roofs, a spacious cowshed from which emanated the warm, contented smell of cattle. The air here was thick with the scent of fresh pine shavings. Straight ahead stood the house, large and built of thick logs, with carved window frames. By the town standards, it wasn't just a house, but a real homestead. The home of a rich man, the foreman of the loggers, the best craftsman in the county. Eleanor came out onto the high porch. She was wearing a light-colored blouse with a lace collar, and an expensive woolen shawl was draped over her shoulders. She descended the steps unhurriedly, with the air of a rightful owner. Matthew, without looking at his wife, began to unhitch the horse. "Get down, what are you waiting for?" Eleanor threw at me. Her voice was dry and unpleasantly grating. I slid off the wagon, my clumsy feet getting tangled in the hem of my dress, and clutched my canvas bundle to my chest. Eleanor came closer, wrinkling her nose in disgust. "You're filthy. You're not coming into the house in those boots. Take them off in the entryway now." I obeyed, kicking off my muddy shoes and stepping barefoot onto the clean, scrubbed yellow floorboards of the entryway. Then, following Eleanor, I entered the house. Inside, it was warm, well-heated, and spacious. In the corner, under a crucifix, were old icons in heavy frames. White curtains hung on the windows. Along the wall stood a huge Russian stove, and next to it, closer to the door, was a wide wooden chest covered with an old, homespun rug. Eleanor stopped in the middle of the room, her arms crossed over her chest. "Listen to me carefully, girl. I won't repeat myself. In this house, you are nothing. Your job is to work and keep quiet, wash the floors, clean the livestock, do our laundry from morning till night. You'll live here." She nodded at the chest by the door. "I'll feed you what's left over from our meals. If you try to steal a scrap from the table, I'll break your hands." She spoke evenly, without shouting, but in every word, there was such a cold, calculated cruelty that it became hard to breathe. I stood barefoot on a strange floor, clutching my bundle, and I understood. My Aunt hadn't just sold me. She had sold me into slavery to a woman who hated me simply because I was young and healthy. The door creaked behind me. Matthew entered the house, ducking his head. In the enclosed space of the room, he seemed even bigger. His broad shoulders almost brushed the doorframe. His heavy gaze from under thick brows swept over me and settled on his wife. I instinctively pressed my back against the warm brick of the stove. This stern, silent giant terrified me. In my mind, he was the main villain, the master who had paid for the right to use me. I expected him to add his own threats, to order me to do something. But Matthew just walked to the washstand, rinsed his large, calloused hands, wiped them on the towel hanging on a nail, and silently sat down at the table. "Go change into something for work," Eleanor ordered, noticing my fear. "And then go get some wood. The stove needs to be lit for dinner." The rest of the day passed in a heavy, hazy dream. I carried wood, washed the floors in the entryway, peeled potatoes, afraid to lift my eyes. Every time Matthew passed through the yard or came into the house for a tool, I tensed up, expecting a blow or a harsh shout, but he seemed not to notice me. The real terror came in the evening. As dusk fell, Eleanor drew the curtains and lit the kerosene lamp. The remains of dinner were on the table. I sat on my chest in the corner, not daring to move. Eleanor got up from the table, straightened her blouse, and looked at Matthew. He was sitting with his elbows on the table, slowly turning an empty wooden mug in his fingers. "I'm going to my room," Eleanor announced loudly, defiantly. She went up to her husband and lowered her voice, but in the evening quiet of the house, every word was audible. "Get it done, Matthew. You paid for her, so take what's yours. I need a child from this girl by next summer, not her size in the corner." She turned and went into the adjoining room, the brighter master bedroom, closing the door firmly behind her. The metal hook clicked into place. We were alone. The air in the house suddenly became heavy, sticky, and it was impossible to breathe. I sat on the hard chest, my fingers gripping the edge of the old rug. A fine, uncontrollable tremor ran through my body. I squeezed my eyes shut so tightly that red circles swam before them. A stool scraped as it was pushed back. The heavy footsteps on the floorboards echoed loudly in my ears. 1 step, 2, 3. He was coming toward me. I curled into a ball, pulling my knees to my chin, bracing myself for the pain, the brute force, the humiliation for which I had been brought to this house. My teeth clenched of their own accord. The footsteps stopped right in front of me. I could smell tobacco and the strong scent of a man's sweat. A second passed, then 2, then 3. Nothing happened. Slowly, my heart pounding, I opened my eyes. Matthew was standing before me. In the dim light of the kerosene lamp, his stern face, etched with deep wrinkles, seemed impassive and harsh. A thick black beard hid his lips. He looked down at me, and in his heavy, unblinking gaze, I suddenly saw not lust, not a master's malice, but a kind of endless, hollow weariness. He let out a heavy, noisy sigh. Matthew did not reach for me. He turned away, took a step toward the stove, and took a heavy, dark cloth-covered sheepskin coat from a hook. He went back to the wooden bench that stood against the opposite wall. It was where he usually kept his tools and woodworking projects. He threw the coat onto the hard planks of the bench, pulled off his boots, remaining in thick woolen socks, and unbuckled his belt. Then he lay down on that narrow, hard bench, placing a rolled-up work jacket under his head, and turned his back to me, facing the log wall. "Sleep, little girl." His low, deep voice echoed in the silence. "Don't tremble." I sat there, my mouth open, unable to believe my ears. "You can't force love," he continued, his voice even, without turning his head. "I took you in to save you from trouble, not for my own pleasure. Sleep." He didn't say another word. A few minutes later, the sound of the even, deep breathing of a sleeping person came from the direction of the bench. I didn't sleep until dawn, lying on my chest, covered with an old scarf, staring at the dark ceiling and listening to that steady breathing. Nothing made sense in my head. I had expected a monster, but this huge, terrifying man had simply lain down on bare boards so as not to frighten me. But the illusions of youth are selfish. I felt no gratitude. In my 19-year-old mind, still aching from Bobby's betrayal, Matthew's act took on a different meaning. So, he's disgusted by me, I thought with bitter resentment. He bought me like a work animal to please his wife. He pitied the poor girl. My pride built an icy wall around me. I decided I would not show them my pain or my fear. I would work off their pathetic money, but I would not utter a single word of complaint. Thus began the months of my domestic hell and our cold coexistence. Eleanor proved to be inventive in her cruelty. She took pleasure in humiliating me. She would make me rewash the floors if she noticed a drop of water on the threshold. She gave me the dirtiest, heaviest laundry to wash, which I rinsed in the icy river water until my hands turned red and were covered in small, stinging cracks. "You're not scrubbing hard enough, you good-for-nothing," she would hiss, checking the shirt collars. "What are we even feeding you for?" I would remain silent, clenching my teeth so hard my jaw ached, take a piece of coarse soap, and scrub again. Throughout the entire day, I might only say 2 words. "It's done," and yes. My face became an impenetrable mask. Matthew worked all day, leaving before dawn and returning late at night. At home, he also barely spoke. We lived like strangers under one roof. But soon, the icy shell of my indifference began to crack from within, a crack that threatened to destroy my life completely. 2 months had passed since I moved into Matthew's house. A deep autumn had set in. Cold rains fell from morning till night. The ground had turned into an impassable mire. One morning, as I stood by the stove trying to pull out a heavy cast-iron pot of porridge with a potholder, I felt a hot, suffocating nausea rise in my throat. My vision blurred. I barely managed to put the pot down and run out into the entryway, covering my mouth with my hand. I was violently, miserably sick. I sat on the cold porch steps, pressing my forehead against the damp wood of the railing, and inside me, a panicky animal terror was growing. The nausea was not a coincidence. My period was long overdue. My body was changing, my breasts were heavy, and there was a strange pulling sensation in my lower abdomen. I was pregnant with Bobby's child. That August night, those vows by the river, that tarnished copper ring that I still kept hidden at the bottom of my satchel. Bobby had rejected me, betrayed me, thrown me away like a useless thing, but he had left me with this terrible gift. I sat on the porch, hugging my shoulders, and I was shaking violently. What would happen when Eleanor found out? She had bought me to bear a child for her husband, but Matthew hadn't even touched me. My growing belly would be proof of my disgrace. Eleanor would realize that I had come to them already carrying another man's child. She would throw me out into the autumn mud. I remembered my step-aunt's threats. No one will take you in. You'll be sent away or rot in a ditch. Pregnant, without a penny to my name, without papers, shamed throughout the county. It was a certain, slow death. From that day on, fear became my constant companion. I began to stoop, wearing a loose old work coat even in the warmly heated house, and tied my apron tightly around my waist. I was afraid to even turn sideways in front of Eleanor. But while I might have been able to deceive Eleanor, who was consumed by her own malice and nitpicking, it was impossible to fool Matthew. He was too observant. A carpenter's eye, accustomed to noticing millimeter-sized irregularities in a board, saw everything. It happened in mid-November. I was cleaning the cowshed. The work was hard. The manure had become compacted. I dug the pitchfork into the dense mass, leaning my whole weight on the handle, trying to lift a clump. A pulling pain shot through my back. I let out a muffled groan and straightened up, instinctively pressing a hand to my slightly rounded belly. At that moment, the cowshed door creaked. Matthew was standing on the threshold. He was holding an axe, about to go chop wood. His gaze, heavy and sharp, fell directly on my hand resting on my stomach, on my baggy coat, on my pale, frightened face. Matthew understood everything in an instant. He knew that nothing had happened between us. He knew how much time had passed since the day he brought me to his house. The math was simple and ruthless. I froze, unable to lower my hand. My heart was pounding somewhere in my throat, cutting off my breath. Now he would turn around, go to the house, tell Eleanor, and it would all be over. They would throw me out. Matthew looked at me for several long, unbearable seconds. His jaw tightened. The muscles in his cheeks stood out. His face became even sterner than usual. And then, he silently lowered the axe, stepped toward me through the manure, and took the pitchfork from my white, numb fingers. "Go inside," he said in an even, expressionless voice. "It's cold out here, I'll finish up." I stumbled backward over the threshold and ran out into the yard. He didn't tell Eleanor. A day passed, then 2, then a week. Nothing in the house changed. Eleanor continued to nag me for every speck of dust, waiting for Matthew to do his duty. And Matthew remained silent. Moreover, strange, frightening changes began to occur in his behavior. I would go to the well for water, fill 2 heavy buckets, and hoist the yoke onto my shoulders. The water would splash, the icy drops burning my legs. I would walk, slipping on the icy path, clenching my teeth. Suddenly, a huge figure would appear behind me. Matthew would approach silently, without looking at me, and simply take the yoke from my shoulders, swing it onto his own, and carry it to the house. He would set the buckets in the entryway and go to chop wood. Not a word, not a reproach. At the table, when Eleanor turned to the stove for more food, he would quickly and discreetly slide the largest, fattest piece of meat from his plate onto mine. When heavy sacks of flour needed to be carried from the barn, I would invariably find them already standing in the entryway. He was protecting me, protecting the woman who was carrying another man's child. I didn't understand it. In my broken world, no one did anything for nothing. My step-aunt had sold me. Bobby had betrayed me. Eleanor humiliated me. What did this huge, silent man want? My pride wouldn't let me accept his help with gratitude. I was shaking with anger. I saw his actions as handouts, as the gesture of a rich master who simply pitied a spoiled thing. "I don't need your charity." Everything inside me screamed when I looked at his broad back. "You bought me? I'll work it off. I'll work off every last penny." I responded to his help with even icier silence. I would turn away when he set a heavy bucket in front of me. I would stare at my plate when he gave me food. I had built a solid defense around myself, not understanding that this stern man had already made a decision that would soon tear this house apart from the inside. My belly grew. Winter took hold, covering the town in deep snow. The day when it would be physically impossible to hide the truth was approaching. The day I awaited like a death sentence. March was harsh and cold. During the day, the sun would slightly melt the snow on the roofs, and at night, a hard frost would hit, turning the town's roads into icy ruts. My time came almost 2 months early. It happened in the evening, when I had gone to the well out of habit. I had only managed to lower the bucket when a heavy, pulling pain seized my lower abdomen, so intense that I dropped the chain. It unwound with a clatter. The bucket hit the water somewhere below with a dull thud. I leaned my back against the icy well frame, gasping for the cold air. The boy who helped with chores ran to the other end of town for Granny Ruth, the local midwife. The house immediately became stuffy and chaotic. Ruth, a dry, nimble old woman in a dark scarf pulled down to her eyebrows, immediately stoked the stove to full capacity. She heated water in huge cast-iron pots, constantly crossing herself before the icons in the corner and muttering endless prayers under her breath. She smelled strongly of dry wormwood, laundry soap, and old sheepskin. I was laid on a wide bed behind a curtain. Eleanor couldn't find a place for herself. She paced the clean floorboards of the house, constantly adjusting her expensive woolen shawl. Her thin lips were pursed in displeasure. She felt no pity for me. To her, I was just a purchased mechanism that had started to malfunction ahead of schedule. What's she wailing for? Eleanor snapped irritably when I couldn't suppress a low moan during another contraction. All women give birth. Tell her to save her strength, Ruth. I don't need a sick baby. Oh, dear Mrs. Thorne, what a sinful thing to say, the midwife muttered, not looking up from her pots. The birth is early and difficult. The girl is young, her pelvis is narrow. It'll be a struggle for her to survive. She'll survive. She's not going anywhere. She's been paid for, Eleanor retorted, and sat down heavily on a stool at the table. And from the yard came a sound that didn't stop for a minute, the dull, rhythmic, merciless thud of an axe. Matthew was chopping wood. He had gone out as soon as Ruth had crossed the threshold, thrown off his warm coat, remaining in just a canvas shirt, and started on the woodpile. He was splitting huge, impossibly heavy pine logs with such ferocity, as if trying to vent his tension. Swing, strike, swing, strike. I lay on the sweat-drenched sheets, biting the corner of a rolled towel to keep from screaming, and listened to that sound. I knew why he was out there. Math is a stubborn thing. Matthew could count. He knew the day I had come to his house. He knew that the child who was now fighting its way into the world was coming too early for the town to believe that anything had happened between us on that first night. He was preparing himself. He was methodically taking out his tension on the heavy wood, waiting for the resolution that was about to turn everything upside down. The contractions merged into one continuous, exhausting agony. Time lost all meaning. The house became as hot as a sauna. The air was thick with the smell of hot water, blood, and wet wood. "Come on, girl, push," Ruth commanded sternly, pressing her hard hands on my stomach. "Don't spare yourself. You'll harm the child." I gathered the last of my strength. Dark circles swam before my eyes. I gripped the iron bars of the headboard with my numb fingers, tensed with all my might until my ears rang, and put everything I had left into that final push. The silence of the stuffy house was broken by a thin, piercing cry. The sound instantly cut through the pain, leaving only a ringing, depleting weakness. I threw my head back on the pillow, gasping for air with my dry lips. "Thank you, Lord," Ruth breathed out, deftly tying the umbilical cord. "It's a girl, Hope, small but with a strong set of lungs. She'll live." The curtain was abruptly pulled aside. Eleanor stood in the opening. Her face was twisted with initial disappointment. She had been expecting an heir, a boy who would forever tie her to her husband's wealth, but a girl was born. But this was only the beginning of the storm. Ruth quickly washed the baby in a basin, wrapped her in a clean linen cloth, and turned to the light of the kerosene lamp to wipe the infant's face. Eleanor stepped closer. She unceremoniously peered into the bundle. A moment of absolute dead silence followed. The only sound was the crackling of the logs in the stove. The baby was not bald. A soft, distinct fuzz covered her small, wrinkled head. And that fuzz was a bright, coppery red, a color that was impossible to mistake for anything else. My hair was dark blonde. Matthew's was black as tar. There were no redheads in either of our families, as far back as anyone could remember. It was the genetics of Bobby, the accordion player who had disowned me on that rainy night. Eleanor slowly raised her head. Her face was blotchy with red patches. Her eyes widened. Her nostrils flared. For a second, she was silent, putting together the timeline, the hair color, and my icy behavior all these months. And then she exploded. "What have you brought into this world, you tramp?" Eleanor shrieked, making Ruth jump and clutch the baby to her chest. Her voice broke into a hoarse cry. She rushed to the bed, grabbed the collar of my wet nightgown, and shook me violently. I was too weak to resist. My head lolled helplessly on the pillow. "Whore!" she screamed, spittle flying into my face. "You worthless beggar! You brought a bastard into my house! You came to me pregnant!" She flung me away in disgust, turned to the door, and yelled at the top of her lungs. Matthew, get in here. Look what this shameless hussy has given us." The door to the entryway slammed open. The sound of the axe in the yard had stopped a few minutes ago, when the baby's cry was heard. Matthew entered the house, ducking his head. He was a terrifying sight. His shirt was open at the chest, dark with sweat. Sawdust clung to his beard. His chest heaved. He took 2 large steps and stopped in the middle of the room, looking at his wife. "Look!" Eleanor pointed a finger at the midwife. She was shaking with rage. "Look at this spawn. She's a redhead. This girl came to us already carrying another man's child. You never even touched her. I know it. I've been deceived. That old rat Teresa robbed me." I lay on the bed, not daring to breathe. A paralyzing, animal terror gripped my body. This was it. Now he would grab me by the scruff of the neck, in my wet nightgown, and throw me out into the freezing March snow with the baby. And no one in the town would blame him. The law was on his side. I had deceived them. I had brought another man's blood into his house. Eleanor ran to her husband, her white-knuckled fingers clutching the sleeve of his shirt. "Throw her out, Matthew, right now. Throw this shameless woman and her child out into the cold. Let them fend for themselves. Tomorrow, you'll go to the county. I want every penny back from her step-aunt." Matthew wasn't looking at Eleanor. His heavy, unblinking gaze was fixed on me. He looked at my pale, exhausted face, at my swollen eyes, full of the tears of unbearable fear. Then he shifted his gaze to Ruth. The midwife stood there, more dead than alive, clutching the red-haired infant. Matthew took a step toward the old woman. Carefully, with his huge, calloused hands, he pulled back the edge of the linen cloth and looked at the baby. His jaw tightened. The muscles in his cheeks stood out. His face became a stone mask, expressing absolutely nothing. "Matthew, are you deaf?" Eleanor shrieked, pulling at his sleeve. "Get rid of her!" Matthew slowly, very slowly, turned to his wife. He didn't shout, he didn't raise his hand. He just looked down at her, with a look that sent a chill down my spine. It was the look of a man who had long tolerated filth, but had finally decided to wash it away for good. He roughly, with one swift movement, shook Eleanor's hand from his sleeve. "This is my child," he said. His voice was not loud, but it resonated in the stuffy house with an unexpected weight. Ruth gasped and quickly crossed herself. I stopped breathing. Eleanor recoiled as if she had been slapped. Her mouth fell open helplessly. "What? Are you out of your mind?" she croaked, looking nervously at the midwife, hoping for support. "Count the months. Look at her hair. How can she be yours?" Matthew took a step toward her, looming over her like a rock. I said, "This is my child," he repeated, emphasizing each word. "And my woman." Eleanor turned pale, the reality of the situation beginning to dawn on her. She understood that her husband was not blind or crazy. He had known for a long time. And now, in front of a witness, he was taking on another sin to protect the one she had considered a work animal. "You'd trade me for this girl with her bastard child?" Eleanor hissed venomously, her voice dropping. The arrogant city woman in her resurfaced. "You'll be lost without me. Have you forgotten who brought order to this house?" Matthew didn't flinch. "I tolerated you, Eleanor," he said in the same, even, frightening voice. "I tolerated you because I thought you had a soul. I thought, if God didn't give you children, at least your heart would be soft. But you're a rotten board, painted on the outside, but sawdust on the inside." He pointed to the door. "Pack your things." "What?" Eleanor choked. "How dare you? This is my house." "The house is mine," Matthew cut her off. "Tomorrow I'll hitch the wagon and take you to your family in the county. And I don't want to see you in this house by morning. Go to your room and pack your trunks. Get out." Eleanor stood there, breathing heavily. She understood that she had lost. This stern, silent man, whom she had grown accustomed to ordering around, had thrown her out of his life with a single word. She spat venomously on the clean floorboards, turned sharply, and, with her head held high, went into the adjoining room, slamming the door behind her. Matthew stood in the middle of the house for a few more seconds. Then he looked at the frozen midwife. "Is she clean?" he asked shortly. The midwife nodded frantically. "Give her here." He approached carefully, trying not to crush her, took the small, wailing bundle from her hands and came to the bed. I looked up at him, unable to stop the tears that now flowed in a continuous hot stream. Matthew gently placed the baby on my chest. "Sleep. Hope," he said softly, looking directly into my eyes. "It's over. No one will bother you again." He turned, took a few crumpled bills from his pocket, pressed them into the hands of the stunned midwife, and went out into the entryway, carefully closing the door behind him. The next day, a trial was held. A trial without judges, but with the strictest of juries, the town's women. The morning was clear and frosty. Matthew, as promised, brought the wagon out of the yard and hitched the big gelding. He silently carried Eleanor's heavy, wrought-iron trunks from her room and placed them on the wagon. Eleanor came out onto the porch. She was wearing her most expensive velvet coat and a silk scarf. She tried to keep her back straight, affecting an air of contempt, but her face betrayed her fury. And at the open gates, people were already standing. The news that the wealthy carpenter was throwing out his city wife had spread through the town before sunrise. Ruth, though she had sworn to secrecy, couldn't keep such a sensational story to herself. A dozen women were lined up at the neighboring fences, whispering among themselves. Eleanor descended the steps. She had to walk across the entire yard under the scrutiny of their sharp, mocking gazes. "Well, look at that, the lady is leaving." A neighbor, Darlene, said loudly, leaning on the fence. "Looks like the country life didn't agree with her." "What do you expect?" another chimed in. "They say Matthew threw her out for her snake-like temper. She was tormenting that young girl, so the man couldn't take it anymore." Eleanor flushed. She stopped by the wagon, glaring at the neighbors. "Shut your mouths, you unwashed country folk," she shouted, her voice breaking. "I'm leaving on my own. You have to get away from a tyrant like him. He tried to pin another man's child on me." The women just laughed together. In the town, they didn't like those who held themselves above others. "Oh, don't lie, Eleanor," Darlene shouted. "Ruth told us everything. The man claimed his child and threw you, you barren, spiteful woman, out into the cold. Good riddance." Eleanor choked on the humiliation. She had been publicly stripped of her status, her pride trampled in front of the whole street. She quickly, stumbling over the hem of her long coat, climbed onto the wagon and turned away, hiding her burning face in her collar. Matthew, ignoring the women's chatter, took the reins and led the horse out of the yard. He didn't look back once. The house became unusually quiet. I lay in bed, holding my cooing Catherine, and listened as the creak of the wagon faded down the frozen road. I didn't know how we would live now. I didn't understand how to look into the eyes of a man who knew my shame, had kept silent about it for months, and then shielded me from all the world's filth with his broad back. Back then, at 19, I still didn't know how to be grateful. My pride and my fear were too raw. I thought Matthew had kept me out of pity, that he simply couldn't throw a baby out into the cold, and I had come along as part of the deal. The ice that had encased my soul on the day of my step-aunt's transaction had not yet melted. We were left alone in a huge house, bound by a terrible secret and a child in whose veins flowed the blood of a traitor. But it was on that day, to the shouts of the neighbors and the creak of the departing wagon, that hope settled in this house. After Eleanor's departure, the house changed. The heavy, oppressive density of deceit was gone, but in its place came a ringing, tense awkwardness. The three of us were left. Me, tiny Catherine, and the man who, with a single word, had overturned his wife's plans and taken on another's sin. I expected that now, with the truth revealed, Matthew would demand gratitude. I waited for long lectures or reproaches, but he continued to live as if nothing special had happened. In the morning, he would go to his workshop or out to the woods, and in the evening, he would return, wash his hands at the washstand, and sit down at the table. Only now, he didn't turn to face the wall. 2 weeks after the birth, When I was beginning to get up and do some housework, Matthew stayed in his workshop late into the night. I sat on the bed nursing Catherine and listened to the steady, careful sound of a plane and the rustle of sandpaper coming from the yard. He came into the house quietly, trying not to make the floorboards creak. In his hands, he held something large, covered with a clean piece of burlap. Matthew came to the bed, placed his burden on the floor, and pulled off the fabric. It was a wooden cradle. I had seen many cradles in the town. Usually, men would hastily nail them together from simple, unplaned boards, just so the baby wouldn't roll off onto the floor. But what Matthew had brought was a true piece of fine craftsmanship. The cradle was carved from light-colored wood, from which the rich smell of fresh resin emanated. Matthew had sanded the sides so smooth that they felt like river pebbles. Not a single sharp corner, not a single splinter. And along the very edge, where a baby would grasp with its little hands, was a neat, carved pattern of oak leaves. Matthew shifted from foot to foot, hiding his huge hands in the pockets of his work pants. "I put the hook in the ceiling yesterday," he said in an even voice, looking not at me, but at the sleeping baby. "It's not right for a baby to sleep in a big bed. You might roll over on her in your sleep. Let me move her." I looked at those carved leaves. A heavy lump rose in my throat. This stern, silent carpenter had spent his nights, after a hard day's work, carving patterns for a child in whose veins flowed the blood of a cowardly town accordionist. He hadn't said a word about love. He hadn't asked me to forget the past. He had simply brought a safe and beautiful place for my daughter to sleep. "Thank you, Matthew," my voice came out hoarse. He nodded, easily picked up the cradle, hung it on a thick rope from a ceiling beam, and went to the stove. And I lay back on the pillow, feeling the icy wall of my pride crack for the first time. 19 is a foolish age. I thought that if I opened my soul to him, I would be betraying myself, betraying those spring evenings by the river. I continued to keep my distance, responding to his care with restrained, short phrases. Fate does not tolerate half measures. It prefers to break foolishness harshly and quickly. The end of November arrived. The snow had not yet fallen, but the ground was already frozen, covered with a hard, brittle crust of ice. In the lowlands and near the swamps, there was an impassable, frozen mud. That day, from early morning, the sky was covered with a uniform gray blanket. A freezing, cutting rain mixed with snow began to fall. The wind howled in the chimney, making my ears ache. Matthew had gone to the county for nails and window hinges. I was busy at the stove, rolling out dough on the table. Catherine was sleeping in her new cradle. Through the noise of the wind, I heard a loud, unnatural crack from the direction of the yard. Peeking out the cloudy window, I saw that an old section of the wooden cattle pen, which had rotted at the base, had not withstood a gust of wind and had fallen over. Our 2 cows, frightened by the noise and the weather, were slowly but surely making their way through the gap. They were heading straight for the far end of the garden, beyond which was a steep descent to a marshy lowland. If a heavy cow got into the unfrozen bog, it would be impossible to get it out. In the town, losing a cow meant starvation. There was no time to wait for help. I threw an old, padded jacket over my calico dress, slipped my bare feet into Matthew's rubber boots that were in the entryway, and ran outside. The icy wind immediately hit my face, taking my breath away. The rain was fine and prickly. It instantly soaked the thin scarf on my head. The boots were too big. They squished heavily through the mud and threatened to fly off with every step. I ran across the garden, sinking into the icy mess. I caught up with the cows at the very edge of the swamp. They had huddled together, their heads stubbornly lowered, and refused to go against the wind back to the house. I shouted at them, driving them with a heavy, wet branch I had picked up from the ground. I slipped on the icy clay, fell to my knees, scraping my palms on the rough roots, got up, and drove the animals up the slope again. The cold water had seeped into the wide tops of the boots. The jacket was soaked through and had become heavy. It felt like I had spent a whole day in that piercing wind, though no more than 20 minutes had passed. When I finally herded the cows into the intact part of the cowshed and closed the heavy bolt, I had no strength left to go to the house. My fingers were red and wouldn't bend. I leaned my shoulder against the log wall in the entryway, breathing heavily, with a wheeze, the cold air. By evening, when Matthew returned, I was sitting on the bed, wrapped tightly in a sheepskin coat. I was shaking with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. My teeth chattered so hard that I bit my lip until it bled. Matthew looked at my wet hair, at the puddle of water by the threshold where the discarded jacket lay. He didn't ask a single question, quickly stoked the stove to a roaring heat, brewed some raspberry leaf tea, and made me drink a huge mug of the scalding concoction. But the warmth didn't come. The cold seemed to have seeped deep into my bones. That night, a sharp pain gripped my chest. Every breath was a struggle. The air scratched my dry throat. Then I was thrown into a thick, sticky sweat. Pneumonia had set in, the terrible country fever that, in those years, took people in a matter of days. The next 2 days blurred into one dark, viscous nightmare. Time lost all meaning. The fever consumed me completely. I would sink into a stuffy blackness, then surface, choking on a cough that drained all my strength. I tossed and turned on the damp sheets, trying to throw off the heavy blanket. Matthew never left my side. I could feel his presence through the hazy veil of illness. He constantly changed the wet, cold cloths on my forehead. He would lift my head, supporting it with his broad, rough palm, and pour bitter herbal infusions into my parched mouth. Ruth barely let Catherine out of her sight during those days, bringing her to me only for feedings. And when I lost consciousness, she would feed the baby warm goat's milk. On the third night, my temperature reached its peak. My mind became clouded. In my delirium, I returned to that August night. I thought I was standing by the river again. The water lapped at the bank, and the air smelled of lilac. I saw Bobby in front of me. He was smiling, hiding the copper ring in his pocket, and then the river began to rise. The dark water pulled at the hem of my dress, dragging me to the bottom. I thrashed on the pillow, reaching out my hands, trying to grasp the fading image. "Bobby!" A dry, hoarse whisper escaped my chapped lips. "Bobby, get me out of here, save me." I repeated his name over and over, choking on a heavy cough. Matthew was sitting on a low stool right by the bed. He had just wrung out a piece of linen in a basin, about to place it on my forehead. Hearing my words, he froze. His fingers clenched the wet cloth with such force that water ran down his wrist and onto the floor. His face, in the dim light of the kerosene lamp, darkened. His jaw tightened. The muscles in his cheeks stood out. Any other man in his place would have spat on the floor, thrown down the cloth, and gone out to the porch to smoke. Any other man would have hated the woman who, on the verge of death, was calling for the one who had betrayed her. But Matthew did not get up. He let out a heavy, ragged breath, unclenched his fingers, and carefully, almost gently, placed the cool cloth on my burning forehead. He took that blow in silence. My breathing became shallower. My chest barely rose. The cough turned into a heavy wheeze. Matthew realized that the herbs were no longer helping. Things were taking a turn for the worse. He got up from the stool, quickly put on his heavy sheepskin coat, and pulled on his hat. Taking the wagon was impossible. The wheels would have gotten stuck in the frozen, ice-covered mud. Matthew led the horse out of the stable and threw on a saddle. He had to travel 20 miles to the county hospital. Through the night, through an ice storm, on a road that no longer existed. I don't remember how long he was gone. I had sunk into an absolute silence. Waking up was strange. First, my sense of smell returned. Instead of the usual scent of pine shavings and stove ash, the house smelled sharply of camphor, iodine, and alcohol. Then I felt that I could breathe. The pain in my chest remained, but the heaviness was gone. I struggled to open my heavy eyelids. A dim winter dawn was breaking through the window. Near the table stood a short, stooped man in glasses. It was Dr. Miller, the old county physician. He was snapping the metal clasps of his worn leather bag. I turned my head. My neck was weak, as if it belonged to someone else. By the stove, sitting right on the floor, leaning his back against the brickwork, was Matthew. He was asleep. His head had fallen onto his chest. His clothes were a solid mess of dried gray clay. His heavy boots were covered in a crust of ice. His hands lay limply on his knees. But what struck me most was his face. In his thick black beard, on the right side, was a wide, completely white streak of hair. It hadn't been there 3 days ago. He had gone gray in one night. The doctor noticed that I had opened my eyes. He came to the bed, adjusted his glasses on his nose, and touched my forehead with his dry, warm hand. "She'll pull through," he said in a creaky, tired voice. "The crisis has passed. She's young, she'll live." I tried to say something, but only a weak rasp came from my throat. Dr. Miller nodded toward the sleeping Matthew by the stove. You should bow down to him, Hope. Bow down to the ground. The doctor sat down on the edge of a chair, wiping his glasses with the corner of his coat. I refused to come out tonight. A terrible storm, pitch dark. A horse could break a leg, and I'm not in any shape to be trudging through snow and mud. But he burst into my house. His eyes were wild. He was covered in clay. He grabbed my bag, wrapped me, an old man in his coat, and put me on his horse, and he walked alongside. The doctor fell silent, looking at his hands. 20 miles, Hope. Up to his knees in icy slush. He led the horse by the bridle so we wouldn't fall into a ravine. And where the creek had flooded the ford, he carried me on his back so I wouldn't get wet. He snatched you from the jaws of death. Dr. Miller stood up, closed his bag, and went into the entryway to get dressed. I was left alone in the quiet house with the sleeping man. My gaze was fixed on his white streak of hair. The doctor's words rang in my ears. I remembered my delirium. I remembered calling for Bobby. Matthew had heard it. He knew I was longing for another. And knowing this, he had gone through the cold, breaking himself, not to save his wife, but to save the woman who was looking toward another town. Not for himself, for me. Matthew stirred in his sleep and opened his eyes. He slowly focused his gaze, saw that I was looking at him. He pushed himself up from the floor, leaning on his hands, and came to the bed. His face was gray with exhaustion. He sat down on the stool, reached out his huge hand, covered in fresh scrapes from the journey, and covered my thin fingers. The fever's broken, he said in a low, hoarse voice. I looked into his deep dark eyes and couldn't hold back the tears. They streamed down my temples, hot and fast. Matthew misunderstood my tears. He swallowed hard, looking away toward the window. His fingers on my hand trembled slightly. Don't cry, Hope, he said quietly. His voice was even, but it held a heavy, deep pain. I heard everything. When you get better, I'll let you go to him. I won't keep you by force. Go to him. Just live, Hope, live. It wasn't a reproach. It was an oath, the highest point of a man's sacrifice. He was giving away the most precious thing he had, just so I would keep breathing. Tears streamed from my eyes with new force. But these were not tears of self-pity. They were tears of revelation. I looked at this exhausted man, who had gone gray because of me, and all my girlish foolishness, all my illusions of a spring love, crumbled to dust. The ice that I had carefully built around myself for months finally collapsed, washed away by this hot, salty wave. I turned my wrist and, with the last of my strength, weakly but firmly squeezed his rough, calloused fingers. I'm not going anywhere, Matthew, I whispered. Nowhere. Matthew froze. He looked at me as if he couldn't believe his ears. Then he slowly leaned down, buried his face in the edge of my pillow, and his broad shoulders trembled almost imperceptibly. Later, Matthew got a divorce from Eleanor, and then we were married at the county courthouse. He registered Catherine as his own daughter, giving no one the right to call her another's. I shoved the heavy wooden paddle into the hot belly of the stove, sliding in 2 round, heavy loaves of bread. The heat washed over my face, bringing its usual flush to my cheeks. I closed the damper, wiped my hands on my clean apron, and surveyed our home. 7 years. Time smooths the sharp edges of memory, covering wounds with the thick scab of daily routines. Our house, which had once seemed like a huge, cold cage, now breathed. It creaked with the patter of children's feet, smelled of fresh milk, dried chamomile, and warm sheepskin. In those years, Matthew and I had put down deep, strong roots. Catherine was now 7. She had grown tall and had become a serious, thoughtful girl, wise beyond her years. Her reddish curls, which had once almost cost me my life in the cold, had faded in the summer sun to a light wheat color. After her came quiet, clever Anne, and 3 years ago, our youngest, our son Alex, was born. Alex was my spitting image, dark-haired, with big black eyes and a stubborn, sharp chin, but he had his father's character. The boy was growing up to be unhurried, solid, and followed Matthew everywhere, getting under his heavy boots. The front door creaked. Matthew came in, carrying Alex on his shoulders. The boy held on tightly with his small hands to his father's hair and laughed loudly and merrily. Matthew easily, with one movement, lifted his son down, set him on his feet, and playfully nudged him toward the washstand. I looked at my husband. The years had added more gray to his hair. The deep wrinkles around his eyes had become sharper. But his enormous, bear-like strength had not diminished. He was the foreman, the best craftsman in the county, a man the town mayor shook hands with first. And for me, he had become the air I breathed, the invisible pillar that held up my entire life. We lived well and happily. I was no longer that frightened orphan who averted her gaze. Now I was the rightful lady of the house. I was respected in the town. People would greet me with a nod, calling me respectfully Hope. But someone else's happiness, especially such a solid one, is always a thorn in someone's side. The middle of July was sweltering. The heat hung over the town in a thick, motionless haze. In the evening, as the sun began to set behind the forest, I gathered the laundry that had been soaking since morning into a large wooden tub. The tub was heavy, the wet fabric pulling at my arms. I hoisted it onto my hip and started down the narrow, trodden path to the river, to rinse it on the dock. Matthew had gone to the river a little earlier with the wagon. The horse needed water, and the wagon wheels had dried out in the heat and needed soaking. I was descending the steep slope, carefully stepping on the dry, slippery clay. Below, beyond the thick willows, the water was splashing. Suddenly, through the rustling of leaves, I heard voices. One was Matthew's, low, short, and displeased. The other was a woman's, drawling and sweet, like overheated molasses. I stopped. The heavy tub pressed painfully into my hip. I took 2 quiet steps to the side and carefully parted the flexible willow branches. On the gentle bank, right by the water, stood the wagon. Matthew, with his pants rolled up to his knees, was standing in the river, scrubbing the wooden spokes of a wheel with a stiff brush. And on the dry sand a few steps away stood Louise. Everyone in the town knew Louise, a local divorcee, about 3 years older than me. A striking woman, tall, full-chested, with bright lips always colored with beet juice. She didn't like to work in the fields, often feigning illness. But at the evening socials and at the store, she always appeared in bright, colorful skirts. Her first husband had run off to the city, unable to stand her promiscuous nature. And now, Louise was actively looking for a new warm place. Her gaze had long been fixed on Matthew, a prosperous homestead, a non-drinking, hard-working husband whose every word was law, a real fortress. Louise stood at the very edge of the water. She was wearing a light-colored blouse with a provocatively unbuttoned collar, revealing a smooth, tanned neck. "What are you fussing with that wagon for, Mattie?" she purred, taking a step into the shallow water in her city shoes. "Leave it. Come over here to the shade. I brought some cold lemonade, with mint." Matthew didn't turn around. He continued to methodically scrub the dirty wheel. "Go on your way, Louise," he said gruffly, without raising his head. "I don't need your lemonade." Louise laughed softly, a throaty sound. The rejection didn't embarrass her. It only egged her on. She took another step. The water soaked the hem of her colorful skirt. "Oh, come on, Matthew." She lowered her voice almost to a whisper, but by the quiet river I heard every word. "Am I blind? I see how you live. Your wife is so proper it makes your teeth ache. She walks around all day with rags and pots. You never hear a kind word from her." My fingers, gripping the edge of the wooden tub, turned white. I stopped breathing. The men in our town rarely refused what was offered to them so freely, especially when a woman herself was offering it on a hot summer evening by an empty river. Louise came right up to Matthew. She reached out a hand, trying to run her thin fingers over his wet, tense back. "Why do you need that boring hope?" she cooed, pressing her hip against the side of the wagon. "She didn't even give you her firstborn. The whole town knows. You're raising another man's child. With me, you'll feel like a real man. Come to my place. I'll treat you so well you'll forget your own name." She unbuttoned another button on her blouse. Everything inside me turned to ice. The words "another man's child" hit me like a slap. I waited. Waited for him to turn around, maybe smirk, maybe just gently push her away, trying not to offend her, as many would have done. But what happened next, no one expected. Not me, and certainly not Louise. Matthew straightened up abruptly. His huge body tensed with restrained anger. He turned to her, and I saw his face. There was not a trace of a man's game, no embarrassment. There was only a hard, heavy fury. He didn't try to persuade her. He abruptly thrust out his huge hand and, with a powerful, uncompromising movement, pushed Louise in the shoulder. The blow was so strong that the woman let out a short, choked cry, flailed her arms absurdly, lost her balance on the slippery river stones, and fell backward. She landed right in the muddy shallows, where the water mixed with horse manure and wet clay. Dirty splashes flew in all directions, generously covering her light-colored blouse and face. Somewhere further up the river, on the wooden dock, there was the loud thud of a falling laundry paddle. Two townswomen, Darlene and Nora, the worst gossips in the county, stood frozen with their mouths open, watching the scene. They had seen and heard everything. Louise flailed in the mud, trying to push off the slippery bottom with her hands. Her hair was matted, her painted lips twisted in shock and public humiliation. Matthew stepped out of the water onto the bank, dark and stern. "Open your eyes," he roared. His heavy voice rolled over the water, hitting the opposite bank. He spoke loudly enough for not only Louise to hear, but also the women frozen on the dock. "I have a wife, and there's no one better in the whole world." Louise cringed, pulling her dirty, wet knees to her chest. "If you ever come near my house again," Matthew bit out each word, clenching a wet rag in his fist. "If I ever hear your filthy tongue mention my wife's name again, I'll disgrace you so badly that you won't be able to wash it off in this river or the next. Get out of here." Louise, red with shame and anger, scrambled out of the mud on all fours. She got to her feet, not even trying to brush off the wet skirt that clung to her legs, grabbed her jug of lemonade, and almost ran up the path, stumbling over tree roots. The women on the dock began to whisper excitedly, waving their arms. By tomorrow morning, the whole town, the whole county, would know how the foreman had dragged the town tramp through the mud to defend his wife's honor. Matthew took a deep, ragged breath, calming down. He threw the dirty rag into the wagon, and then he turned his head and looked directly at the willow thicket. He had seen my white scarf among the green leaves. He knew I was there, knew I had seen everything. I stood there, unable to move. The tub of laundry seemed to have grown into my hip. Matthew didn't fuss. He didn't run to me with excuses. "Don't think anything of it." She came on to me. He just got out of the water, wiped his wet hands on his pants, and with a slow, steady pace, walked toward the willows. He came right up, pushed the branches aside with his broad shoulders, and looked at me. In his deep, dark eyes, there was absolute calm. He silently reached out, confidently took the heavy wooden tub from my numb fingers, and easily swung it onto his shoulder. "Let's go home, Hope," he said. "The water's too cold today. I'll rinse them myself this evening." He turned and started up the path, carrying the heavy tub as easily as if it contained a couple of light shirts instead of a mountain of wet fabric. I walked behind him. I looked at his broad, reliable back, the tense muscles under his damp shirt, and in that moment, I felt such a sharp, burning pride that it took my breath away. I understood that this man would never betray me, would never trade me for sweet talk or cheap availability. I was his woman, and he protected our peace firmly, fiercely and unconditionally. Walking along the dusty path behind my husband, for the first time in the 7 years I had lived in this house, I felt not just gratitude. I felt that heavy, real love that grows not from beautiful words but from actions. I looked at him and thought only one word: mine. August that year was unusually dry. The dirt on the country roads had turned to a fine, almost weightless powder that hung in the air from dawn to dusk. The collective harvest was in full swing. From morning till late at night, the town hummed with the heavy roar of tractors and trucks hauling grain. I stood in the yard by a wooden trough, wringing out a heavy, wet sheet. The sun beat down on my back through my thin calico blouse. Matthew had left for the sawmill before dawn. The girls were busy in the garden, and our youngest, Alex, who had just turned 3, was playing somewhere near the open gate with a wooden horse his father had carved for him the day before. I was distracted for only a second to throw the sheet over the clothesline, and in that moment, a scream came from the street. It wasn't a yelp or a cry. It was a terrible, choked woman's scream that made everything inside me instantly seize up. It was followed by the sharp, grinding sound of screeching treads and the heavy thud of metal. My wet hands opened of their own accord. The sheet fell heavily into the road dust. I don't remember how I ran out of the gate. My legs moved independently of my mind. The air suddenly became unbearably thick. Every breath burned my throat. On the road, in a thick cloud of settling yellow dust, a farm tractor with a trailer was stopped crookedly. The driver, a young man from a neighboring crew, had fallen out of the cab and was sitting on the ground, holding his head in his dirty hands, rocking back and forth. And a little further, on the side of the road, lay Alex. He was on his side, one leg drawn up to his stomach. The wooden horse lay a few feet away, broken in two by a wide caterpillar track. There was no blood, only a thick gray dust on his small face and his closed eyes. I rushed to him, fell to my knees, reaching out to grab him, to hold him, but someone's strong fingers grabbed my wrists. "Don't you dare move him, Hope!" A neighbor who had run over shouted in my ear. "You can't move broken bones, you'll kill the boy. We need a wagon." An hour later, we were at the county hospital. Matthew arrived there straight from the logging site, on a stranger's bareback horse. He burst into the narrow hospital corridor, which smelled of carbolic acid and old paint, breathing heavily. Sawdust clung to his beard, and the shirt on his back was dark with sweat. He didn't ask a single question, just came over to me, sitting on a wooden bench, and placed his heavy hand on my shoulder. From that single touch, I began to shake violently, a tremor I had been suppressing with all my might. The elderly county surgeon came out of the treatment room much later. He stood for a long time at the metal sink, scrubbing his hands with a stiff brush, and only then turned to us. His face was gray and tired. "It's bad, Matthew," the doctor said, wiping his hands on a waffle-weave towel. His voice was even, but that evenness made it even more frightening. "His organs are intact, the Lord spared him. But his legs, there are complex fractures. The bones are shattered." Matthew was silent. Only his fingers on my shoulder tightened until it hurt. "I can't do anything here." The surgeon dropped the towel on a chair. "I don't have the equipment or the experience. The boy needs to be taken to the state hospital immediately to Professor Miller. If he doesn't operate today, the boy will either not survive the shock or he'll be a cripple for life. He won't feel his legs." "We'll take him," Matthew said hoarsely. The doctor shook his head, looking at the floor. "It's not that simple, Matthew. There's an ambulance. I'll write a referral. But the surgery, with a specialist and without a waiting list. Special medicines, care. The state will provide a quota in 6 months, but we're talking about hours. We need a lot of money, and we need it by this evening, in cash. Do you have that kind of money?" I closed my eyes. Our house was sturdy. Our farm was prosperous, but we had never seen that kind of cash in our lives. All of Matthew's savings were invested in lumber for his crew. Some had been loaned to neighbors who were struggling to make ends meet and couldn't pay it back now. Matthew slowly removed his hand from my shoulder. His face became like stone. His cheekbones stretched the skin, making them even sharper. He looked at the closed white door behind which our son lay. Then his gaze shifted to me. "Stay here, Hope," he said in an even, expressionless voice. "Don't move a step. I'll be back soon." He turned and walked quickly down the corridor toward the exit with a heavy, marching stride. I learned what happened next later. Leaving the hospital, Matthew didn't run around to the neighbors, begging for help. He knew that no one in the town kept large sums of money under their mattresses. He went straight to our house. Matthew went into his workshop, his sanctuary for many years. It smelled of fresh pine shavings, heated metal, and old linseed oil. Along the log walls, on wooden pegs, hung his tools. It wasn't just iron, it was his history. There were Japanese chisels, ordered through master craftsmen in the city. There was a 2-man saw with a perfect set, which he had honed himself during the long winter evenings. And there, in the most honored place, lay a heavy bog oak plane with a forged blade, passed down from his great-grandfather. His grandfather had used this plane to build houses. In the town, a craftsman's tools are his hands, his pride, and his livelihood. Matthew took a wide canvas potato sack from the corner. He went to his workbench and picked up his great-grandfather's plane. His huge, calloused fingers fit perfectly on the smooth wood, polished by generations. He ran the pad of his thumb over the razor-sharp edge of the blade. For a fraction of a second, he squeezed his eyes shut. His broad chest rose heavily, and a low, choked roar escaped his throat. He unclenched his fingers. The plane fell to the bottom of the canvas sack with a heavy thud. Chisels followed. The clang of tempered steel cut the air. But Matthew didn't stop. He tore planes, drills, and expensive pliers from the walls. He was scooping his soul into a dirty sack, not caring that the blades were dulling against each other. When the walls of the workshop were bare, he tied the top of the sack tightly with a rope, slung the heavy load over his shoulder, and left the yard. In the county seat lived a man named Sullivan, a local dealer, a slippery and calculating man who always had cash on hand, buying valuable things for a pittance from those in need. Matthew walked into his yard, threw the heavy sack onto the wooden floor of the porch, and untied the knot. Sullivan, sipping tea from a saucer, came out onto the porch. He spent a long time sifting through the tools with his plump, white hands, clicking his tongue. He knew the value of every piece of iron in that sack, and he knew that Matthew had not come to him out of good fortune. "Fine tools, no doubt," Sullivan drawled, wiping his hands on his pants. "But who needs them now, Matthew? Times are tough. I'll give you half price for all this, and that's out of respect for your trouble." Matthew stood silently, looking at the dealer with a heavy, unblinking gaze. Sullivan went into the house, brought out a wad of bills, and casually tossed them on the table in front of Matthew. "Here, this should be enough for your doctor." Sullivan smirked, deciding to prick the proud carpenter's pride. "But I'm thinking, Matthew, is it worth it? These are your grandfather's tools, a century old. You're giving them away for nothing. Your boy, I get it, but your oldest, Catherine. The women are saying, 'She's not your blood. You're feeding another man's child, and now you'll be ruined because of them.'" Matthew didn't move. He didn't hit Sullivan, though one blow from him would have been enough to ensure the dealer never got up again. He slowly reached out his huge hand, scooped the wad of money from the table, and clenched it in his fist. Then he looked up at Sullivan. His gaze was so heavy, so ubistwanim in its calm righteousness, that the dealer involuntarily backed away into the doorway. "They are my children," Matthew said. His voice was low, making the floorboards on the porch vibrate. "They are my blood. For them, I would sell my soul if I had to. Take the iron." By evening, we were at the state hospital. The surgery lasted an endless 5 hours. We sat on a hard couch in an empty corridor that smelled of medicine. Matthew held his head in his hands, his elbows on his knees, and didn't say a word. I sat next to him, my shoulder pressed against his still, tense back, and prayed silently. When the professor came out of the operating room, pulling the mask from his face, he looked exhausted. "We put your boy back together," he said, wearily cleaning his glasses. "He'll walk with a limp, of course. The bones were badly shattered, but he'll avoid a wheelchair. He'll live." My legs gave out. If Matthew hadn't caught my elbow, I would have collapsed onto the tile floor. He let out a heavy, whistling breath, and only then did I notice how badly his hands were shaking. 2 days later, when Alex had fully regained consciousness, I left him in the care of the nurses and returned to the town for winter clothes. A long recovery lay ahead. I walked into the yard late in the evening. The house was dark. I went around the house and saw a sliver of dim light coming from under the workshop door. I carefully pulled the handle. Matthew was sitting on a low stump in the middle of the workshop. The walls were lined with empty nails. There wasn't a single wood shaving on the workbench. He sat with his huge, strong hands resting on his knees. His palms were open, fingers pointing up. He was staring at them with an unblinking gaze, as if he didn't understand what they were for anymore. It was the look of a master who had voluntarily deprived himself of the most important thing. The empty workshop was filled with such a ringing, unbearable sorrow that my breath caught. I quietly approached him, knelt on the dirty earthen floor, and wrapped my arms tightly around his waist. I pressed my face to his chest, which smelled of tobacco and old wood. Matthew flinched. His empty hands slowly rose and rested on my shoulders. He buried his face in the top of my head, and I felt his broad back shudder convulsively. "We'll buy new ones, Matthew," I whispered, swallowing hot tears and stumbling over my words in my agitation. "We'll get by, we can do anything. The main thing is that our son is alive. The main thing is that I have you." He said nothing, only held me tighter with his rough, calloused hands, in which his whole life was now enclosed. Time is a fair judge. It doesn't hurry, but it always delivers its verdict, and there is no appeal. A boomerang always returns to the place from which it was thrown. Several years passed. It was late November, the most raw and merciless month in our parts, when the ground was already frozen, but the snow had not yet covered it with its warmth. The wind howled through the town streets, chilling the houses. One such day, Matthew came home from the sawmill earlier than usual. He came into the house without taking off his coat, stopped at the threshold, and looked at me. "Get dressed, Hope. Make up a clean bed in the spare room and find a rubber sheet. I'll be right back." He didn't explain anything, just turned around, went out into the yard, and began to hitch the horse to the wagon. I didn't ask any questions. If Matthew said so, it was necessary. An hour later, the wagon creaked at our porch. Matthew threw back the heavy coat and carried a person into the house in his arms. The person smelled overwhelmingly of stale urine, unwashed body, and some kind of cellar dampness. Matthew laid his burden on the floor on the spread-out rubber sheet. It was Teresa, my step-aunt, the same woman who had sold me for debt, who had threatened to let me rot in prison, and had thrown me out of the house with a single bundle. Now, only half of her remained. Teresa's face was contorted. The left side was completely paralyzed. Her eye was half closed. Her mouth was twisted, and saliva constantly trickled from the corner. Rumors about her had reached us before. She had gotten into new debts, sold the house to some transient workers, and had stayed on with them out of charity. A week ago, she had suffered a severe stroke. The new owners hadn't bothered with a sick old woman. They had simply carried her out to the cold, unheated entryway, thrown her on a pile of old rags, and forgotten about her. She had lain there for several days in the filth, slowly freezing on the icy floor. One of the men had told Matthew about it at the sawmill. Matthew didn't ask for my permission. He knew that to leave a person to freeze, even if that person had once broken your life, was a sin that could not be atoned for. I brought 2 large cast-iron pots of hot water from the stove. We placed a wide tin tub in the middle of the house. Matthew silently cut away the dirty rags that Teresa was wrapped in with a knife and went out onto the porch to smoke. I knelt before the tub, took a piece of coarse laundry soap and a rough washcloth. The water quickly turned a murky, dark gray from the ingrained dirt. Teresa's skin was thin, covered with age spots and bed sores. She was completely helpless, like a baby, only without a baby's cleanliness. I washed her methodically, carefully turning her heavy, limp body. Teresa's healthy right eye followed me relentlessly. She looked at the clean, scrubbed floorboards of our house, at the warmth of the stove, at my hands that were gently washing the dirt from her, the hands of the very girl she had thrown into the abyss. Suddenly, her chest heaved convulsively, and her healthy eye blinked rapidly. A large, cloudy tear rolled down her sunken gray cheek. Then another. She was crying. Crying not from the pain in her paralyzed body, but from an unbearable, crushing shame. Teresa tried to say something. Her lips slapped together, producing unintelligible sounds. With her healthy hand, she weakly scratched the edge of the tin tub, trying to reach my apron. "I sold you hope," she forced out, choking on saliva and tears. The words came with a painful, inhuman effort. "And you've given me paradise." She turned her face away, unable to look me in the eye any longer, and began to whimper in a thin, intermittent wail. I dropped the washcloth into the water and wiped my soapy hands on the corner of my apron. There was no triumph in my soul, no gloating that my enemy was defeated and lying at my feet. There was only a heavy, cold clarity. "I forgive you, Teresa," I said in an even, calm voice, looking at her trembling shoulders. "I don't hold a grudge. Fate saved me, led me to Matthew. My house is full, my children are healthy." Teresa fell silent, greedily catching my every word, as if hoping for a complete absolution of her sins. "But for what you did to me then, breaking me over your knee," my voice grew firmer. It had a steely edge to it. "For selling me like an animal to a strange woman, you will answer not to me." My voice hardened. "You will answer to God. But we will care for you. You won't die of hunger. You will live out your days in warmth." She closed her eyes, and the tears continued to roll down her wet face. She understood that I had given her mercy, but I could not free her from the judgment of her own conscience. Teresa lived in our house for almost 2 more years. She lay in the clean back room, always fed and washed. She rarely spoke, but every time Matthew or I entered the room, she would turn to the wall, hiding her face in the pillow. It was physically painful for her to accept every piece of bread from the hands of those she had tried to destroy. She lived out her days in a heavy, silent repentance, becoming a living testament to the fact that justice always finds its way home. A person's life is like a river. In youth, it boils and foams at the rapids, a torrent of small hurts and quick joys. But closer to the mouth, it becomes wide, calm, and deep. And at the very bottom of this river settles everything that once seemed important, leaving only what is real on the surface. Imperceptibly, day by day, 30 years flew by since that terrible evening when I stood by the stove in my step-aunt's house with a canvas satchel at my feet. I turned 50. Our children had long since grown up and started their own families. Catherine had moved to the city with her husband. Alex had become an engineer. The large house, which had once been filled with the sound of children's voices, grew quiet. One day in early spring, when the roads in the town were a mess of melting snow, I went to the general store for bread. Carefully avoiding the deep puddles, I climbed the wooden steps of the store, and there, by the railing, I almost tripped over a man squatting on the ground. He reeked of stale alcohol, unwashed body, and some kind of cellar dampness. He was wearing a dirty, shiny-from-age overcoat and clutched a crumpled cap in his trembling hands. "Ma'am, spare some change? I'm dying of thirst," he croaked, looking up at me. I stopped on the top step. My bag pulled at my arm, but I couldn't take another step. Before me sat an old man. Although he couldn't have been much older than 50, life had clearly taken its toll. His swollen, ruddy face was covered with a gray, matted stubble. His lower lip hung slack, and his cloudy, watery eyes darted from side to side, not focusing on me. He wheezed as he breathed, his chest sunken. It was Bobby, the accordion player, the most popular boy in town, for whom I had once been ready to walk barefoot to the ends of the earth. I looked down at him. For a fraction of a second, the intoxicating tart smell of August wormwood and the glint of copper wire on my finger flashed in my memory. And then the memory vanished, colliding with the pathetic, foul-smelling reality. He didn't recognize me. To him, I was just another passerby from whom he could beg a few coins for cheap wine. I silently placed my bag on the steps, opened my purse, took out a few bills, far more than he had asked for, and dropped them into his dirty cap. Bobby hastily grabbed the money, his fingers trembling, and in that moment, I saw a deep, old, dirty scar on his little finger. The mark of his broken, cowardly life. The mark of a man who had always chosen the easy way out, until that way led him to the dirty steps of the town store. "God bless you, ma'am," he mumbled, hiding the money in his coat, and immediately turned away, losing all interest in me. I picked up my bag and walked back down the street. There was no pity in my heart, no triumph, no gloating. There was only a great, heavy understanding. The love of two 19-year-olds is beautiful when they sit on a riverbank on warm evenings. But real life is not songs under the moon. It is daily, exhausting work. It is harsh winters, sickness, poverty. It is children you have to pull back from the brink of death. Life requires a backbone. Matthew's backbone was forged from steel. Bobby had none at all. At the first real hardship, he broke, drifted with the current, and drowned. I walked along the side of the road, my lips silently whispering words of gratitude. I thanked fate that, so many years ago, Matthew's strong hand had pulled me out of that mire. The human body is not made of iron, although Matthew worked his whole life as if he were forged from metal. Years of the heaviest physical labor in the logging camps, the relentless work of a carpenter, the icy rains and sleepless nights. But what broke him most of all was that month when we were saving Alex. He had turned himself inside out then, given all his life force, all his will, to save his son. Matthew's heart, that huge, silent, kind heart, had simply run its course. He was in his 80th year. He faded quickly, without long hospital stays, without complaints or groans. One day in late autumn, he simply couldn't get out of bed. He said there was a great pressure in his chest and he couldn't get enough air. The county doctor listened to his chest with a stethoscope for a long time, then took me into the kitchen, putting his stethoscope away in his bag. "His heart is worn out, Hope," the doctor said, looking at the floor. "No medicine will help now. Prepare yourself. A week, maybe 2. The words were unexpected and heavy. The world around me swayed and lost its color. All those days, I never left his bedside. I fed him from a spoon, fluffed his pillows, wiped his brow with a damp cloth. The children rushed from the city and sat beside him, swallowing their tears. But Matthew's eyes searched most for me. The last evening, the house was quiet. The first fluffy snow was falling outside the window, covering the frozen ground with a white blanket. Matthew lay on his back. His breathing was shallow and rapid. His eyes were sunken. I sat on a low chair right by the bed, holding his hand in mine. His huge palm, covered with white scars from his tools, which had once covered my trembling fingers on the day we first met, was now weak and cold. The rough calluses had long since smoothed out. His skin had become thin and dry, like parchment. I stroked his hand, warming it with my breath, trying to transfer my own warmth, my own life to him. Hope! His voice was barely audible, like the rustle of dry leaves. I leaned forward, pressing my cheek to his face. He struggled to open his heavy eyelids. In his fading dark eyes, there was so much peace and so much endless, bottomless tenderness that it took my breath away. "Don't cry, Hope," he whispered, looking right into my soul. "We lived a good life." His fingers trembled weakly, almost imperceptibly, in my hand, trying to return my squeeze. He looked at me one last time, a long, forgiving gaze, then slowly closed his eyes. His chest rose heavily. A short, ragged breath escaped his lips, like a quiet sigh of relief. And that was it. His chest did not fall again. The air in the room suddenly became stuffy and still. I sat motionless, looking at his calm, smooth face. The hand in mine grew rapidly heavier. I couldn't believe it. My mind refused to accept what had just happened, that the man who had been my wall, my air, my life for almost 60 years, was gone, that I was left in this room alone, and suddenly, it broke through me. It wasn't tears, it wasn't crying. I let go of his hand and fell heavily onto the edge of the bed, right over his still heart. A terrible, hoarse, desperate cry of a person who had lost everything in an instant tore from my throat. "Who have you left me to, my only one?" My voice broke, filling the empty, silent house. I dug my twisted fingers into the woolen blanket. I beat my chest against the edge of the bed, feeling neither time nor space. Only now, screaming into the emptiness of the house, did I fully, to the very bottom, comprehend the scale of my loss. I had lost not just a husband, I had lost my support, the man who had shielded me from all the winds of this world with his huge, silent back. The house was filled with a ringing, unbearable emptiness. That night, I understood that with Matthew, the largest, most important part of me had died. Years have passed. The pain doesn't go away. It just grows into you, becomes a part of your breathing, your habits. Today, I am 88 years old. Our house, where Matthew and I lived a lifetime, still stands just as strong. It is often noisy when the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren come to visit. But last night, the atmosphere in the house was heavy. I sat at the head of the large oak table that Matthew had built in the first year of our life together. The family was gathered around the table, my daughter Catherine, her husband, my eldest son-in-law Victor, and their granddaughter, my great-granddaughter Marina. She had recently turned 18. Marina sat on the edge of a stool. She hugged her shoulders and hung her head low, hiding her red, tear-stained eyes. Her thin shoulders trembled slightly. "You have to understand, Mother," Victor said heatedly, pacing the room. He was a hard, pragmatic man, used to measuring everything in dollars. "We only want what's best for her. What kind of husband would he be? That penniless student of hers, Chris. A bunk in a dorm and a measly scholarship. Where will she go? Into poverty?" "Exactly," Catherine chimed in, pursing her lips. "We found her such a good match. The son of the head of the county co-op is asking for her hand. A good-looking boy, with a car, an apartment in the city, and she's being stubborn. 'I won't marry him,' she says. She's in love, and you can't spread love on bread." Victor stopped at the table and looked at me directly. "Hope you tell her. She'll listen to you. You're the eldest. Put your foot down. Forbid this foolishness, otherwise they'll starve." A heavy, expectant silence fell over the house. Everyone was looking at me. I sat, leaning my dry, age-spotted hands on the smooth surface of the table. Suddenly, my chest felt tight. Through the faces of my relatives, another scene appeared before my eyes. A dark house, a canvas satchel fallen on the floor, and the evil whisper of my step-aunt, "I sold you. I'll see you rot in prison if you don't go." No one had stood up for me then. I had been given away like a thing. Slowly, leaning heavily on the table, I rose from my chair. My back no longer straightened completely, but inside me, the same strength that I had learned from my husband awoke. "So, they'll starve." My voice was not loud, but in the silence of the house it sounded firm and heavy. Victor nodded uncertainly, thinking I was on his side. I walked out from behind the table and went to Marina. The girl cringed even more, expecting a blow, expecting that now I, her last hope, would join this pragmatic chorus. I placed a hand on her trembling shoulder. "Lift your head," I said quietly. Marina slowly raised her face. Her eyes were swollen, and wet tracks shone on her cheeks. "Do you love him?" I asked, looking directly into her frightened eyes. She swallowed hard and nodded almost imperceptibly. "I love him, Grandma, more than life itself." I turned to my son-in-law and daughter, straightening my back. "Listen to me, all of you." I articulated my words as Matthew had once articulated them on the porch, defending me from gossip. "In my house, in my family, no one will ever trade someone's life for profit. No one will decide for them who to love." Victor opened his mouth, but I slammed my dry fist on the table. The sound was dull, but it made everyone jump. "You're afraid she'll live in poverty," I continued, looking at my son-in-law. "Aren't you afraid she'll fade away from sorrow next to a man she doesn't love? Aren't you afraid she'll curse you for the rest of her days for breaking her will? I was lucky in my misfortune. I got a Goldman, but I won't let any of you play this lottery with someone else's fate." I turned back to Marina. "Go to your love, little one," I said, and my voice softened. "It's your life to decide. You'll make mistakes, you'll get hurt. They will be your mistakes. And if you need a piece of bread, my door is always open for you." I looked at Victor. "And whoever says a word against her, whoever tries to ruin the wedding, will have to deal with me. You know me. I won't let you on my doorstep again." There was a dead silence in the house. No one dared to object. The authority of Matthew's widow was unshakable. Marina suddenly jumped up from her stool, threw her arms around my neck, and sobbed, pressing her wet face to my shoulder. I stroked her soft hair, feeling a tight, heavy spring uncoil inside me. On that day, the old, rusty chain, forged from others' commands, submission, and broken lives, finally broke. The evil stopped with me. It went no further. Late in the evening, when the relatives had gone, I was left alone. I turned off the light in the house, went to the window, and pressed my forehead against the cold glass. A high, clear sky, studded with large stars, stretched over the town. I stroked the wooden windowsill, made by my husband's hands so many years ago. The wood still seemed warm to me. I knew that from up there, beyond those bright stars, my Matthew, my stern, silent carpenter, my unshakable stone wall, was watching over us. I knew for certain that he was proud of me now. After all, love is not size on a bench or pretty words. Real love smells of pine shavings, exhaustion, and hospital disinfectant. Love is when you can protect your own at any cost, just as he once protected me.